High in the mountains of Tibet, monasteries were often separated by vast valleys, narrow passes, and days of difficult travel. During the early 20th century, monks regularly carried letters and supplies between these remote communities, following trails that had existed for generations. Many of those paths crossed mountains that local villagers believed were home to ancient spirits. Whether those stories were born from faith, isolation, or the unforgiving landscape itself is impossible to know. This is one such story. It concerns a young man named Tenzin. Tenzin had only recently completed his novice training when the abbot entrusted him with an important task. He was to deliver a bundle of handwritten messages to another monastery several miles away. The journey usually took a single day. He left before sunrise, carrying little more than the letters, a prayer wheel, and enough food for the road. By midday, clouds had begun gathering over the mountains. The weather changed quickly. Snow started falling long before anyone expected it. As visibility worsened, Tenzin realized he had wandered far from the main trail. He searched for the stone markers that usually guided travelers through the pass, but the snowfall had already covered them. For nearly an hour, he walked through the storm, hoping to recognize something familiar. Instead, he noticed smoke rising in the distance. Relieved, he followed it. Hidden among the rock stood a tiny stone hermitage. It was unlike any monastery he had ever seen. The building was small, weathered by countless winters, with prayer flags hanging almost motionless despite the wind outside. Warm light spilled gently through the narrow wooden doorway. Tenzin approached the door and knocked. The door almost immediately swung open. Three elderly monks greeted him with quiet smiles. Without any questions, they welcomed him inside. The room was warm. A small fire burned in the center. One of the monks handed him a wooden bowl filled with fresh butter tea. The warmth spread through him almost immediately. For the first time since the storm began, he felt safe. The conversation flowed naturally. They asked where he had traveled from, which monastery he belonged to, who his teacher had been. Tenzin smiled. My teacher was Master Dorje. One of the elderly monks nodded gently. Ah, how is he these days? The smile faded from Tenzin's face. He passed away earlier this year. The room became strangely quiet. The eldest monk looked into the fire, then calmly replied, No, he visited us only a few days ago. Tenzin laughed awkwardly. He assumed the old monk had mistaken him for someone else. No one offered another explanation. The conversation simply continued. And as the evening settled over the mountains, one of the monks prepared a special sleeping mat near the fire. You should remain here tonight, he said. The mountain is dangerous after dark. Tenzin agreed. Before retiring for the night, the eldest monk spoke once more. We have been rebuilding our temple for many years. He smiled kindly. We could use another pair of hands. Stay with us for a while. Tenzin bowed respectfully. I wish I could, but the monastery is expecting me. I must continue my journey in the morning. The old monk simply nodded. As you wish. That was the last thing Tenzin remembered before falling asleep. He awoke shivering. The fire had gone. The walls had disappeared. The roof was gone. Above him stretched only a grey winter sky. He was lying beneath a rough shelter made from pine branches that had been arranged like a small tent against the snow. There was no stone hermitage. There were no prayer flags, and he didn't see any footprints. Only untouched snow stretching across the mountainside. Confused and exhausted, Tenzin eventually found the main trail and returned to his monastery. 3 days had passed. The monk had already organized search parties. Everyone believed he had perished in the storm. When he finally explained what had happened, the monastery fell silent. The abbot listened without interrupting. When Tenzin finished, the old monk asked only one question. Did they offer you butter tea? Yes. And did you drink it? I did. The abbot closed his eyes. After a long silence, he spoke. They were not monks. Tenzin frowned. They only appeared that way. You see, in these mountains, there are old stories about spirits that borrow familiar faces. They know travelers fear the wilderness, so they offer warmth instead. Another elder quietly added, many who accept their hospitality never return. Tenzin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The abbot looked at him carefully. You came back because you refused their invitation. For a long time afterwards, Tenzin never spoke of the incident again. Years passed. The young novice eventually became one of the monastery's oldest monks. The story slowly faded into memory until one winter afternoon, a young monk arrived at the monastery gates. He apologized for being late. He explained that he had become lost during a snowstorm. Tenzin felt an uneasy familiarity. He questioned the novice and asked him to describe everything that had happened. The young monk smiled. I found a small stone hermitage. There were 3 elderly monks living in there. They welcomed me inside. They gave me butter tea. I stayed with them for about a month. Tenzin stared at him. A month? The young monk nodded. They were rebuilding a temple. I helped them carry some stones. They asked me to stay longer. I told them I couldn't, but he smiled. I promised I would return next spring to help them finish. The room felt silent. Tenzin looked at the young monk, then quietly asked, did they ask you to return? Yes, he responded. They seemed pleased when I agreed. None of the older monks spoke. Tenzin slowly rose to his feet. He gathered the senior monks without another word. Throughout the night, Butter lamps were lit across the monastery. Bundles of dried juniper were burned until fragrant smoke drifted through every prayer hall. Protective sutras were recited without interruption. The young monk was gently instructed not to leave the monastery grounds until the ceremonies had been completed. For several days, the prayers continued. No one explained why. The novice simply followed these instructions. And when the final rituals had ended, Tenzin visited him one last time. The young monk quietly sat beside him, then asked, "Do you remember how you came here?" The young monk looked puzzled. After thinking for a moment, he smiled. "I came from my village. I wanted to spend my life at this monastery." Tenzin nodded. "Good. So you have no reason to return." The young monk never understood what the old monk meant, and Tenzin never explained. The monastery remained where it had always stood. The prayers continued. The sacred boundaries were carefully maintained. And among the older monks, one warning was quietly passed from one generation to the next. During a winter journey, you ever find a lonely stone hermitage that has never appeared on any map, accept its warmth if you must, but never promise to return, because not every temple is meant to be finished. Across rural India, old beliefs still linger in quiet villages where traditions are handed down as faithfully as family names. Most travelers who arrive at a stranger's door ask only for food, water, and a place to rest. Ever so often, however, someone arrives carrying something far more dangerous. This is one such story. Suresh and Sundari had been married for 3 years, but they had no children. In the world around them, that absence did not remain private for long. Advice came from every direction: remedies, rituals, temple visits, blessings, all saying, each one offered with certainty and each one followed with hope. Sundari tried everything. She prayed beneath sacred trees, visited shrines in nearby towns, climbed temple steps in heat and dust, and bowed her head before every deity anyone suggested. None of it changed her life. And as often happens, the burden settled mostly on her. People spoke as if the failure belonged to the woman alone. Sundari watched other families raise children, celebrate small milestones, and move through the life she had imagined for herself. It left a quiet sadness in her that never fully went away. One morning, while Suresh was away at work, someone knocked at the door. Sundari opened it and found an old man standing outside in what appeared to be pilgrim robes. Travelers like him were not uncommon in remote villages. Some claimed to offer blessings, others simply wandered from place to place, living on the kindness of strangers. People welcomed them with food, water, and respect, believing that turning away a weary traveler often invited misfortune of its own. And when he raised his hand in greeting, Sundari greeted him with a warm smile. May I have some water, daughter? He asked. She hurried inside and returned with water in a brass vessel. He drank slowly, then sat down on a wooden chair as though he had every right to be there. I came because I saw your sorrow, he said. Where is your husband? At work, Sundari replied. The old man studied her face for a moment. You have no children, he said. Sundari lowered her head and said nothing. His expression softened, and that gentleness disarmed her. For a brief moment, he reminded her of her late father, calm, watchful, and kind in appearance. Then he opened his old sling bag and took out a small packet filled with fine white powder. He placed a little in her hand and blew some lightly toward her face in a quiet gesture that almost felt ceremonial. Sundari, devout and trusting, folded her hands and bowed her head. A short while later, the old man rose and left without saying much more. After he was gone, Sundari felt strangely light, not exactly happy, not exactly calm, just filled with the sense that something had shifted. She waited impatiently for her husband to come home so she could tell him everything. When Suresh returned that evening, he found her almost glowing with excitement. She told him about the old man's visit, the blessing, the powder, and the certainty she felt that his visit meant something good. Suresh laughed at first, but the look on her face made him stop. Please don't mock me, she said quietly. That was when his amusement gave way to concern. Sundari's innocence, which he usually found gentle and endearing, now frightened him. The man had been a stranger. Next time, don't let anyone into the house when I'm not here, he told her. She fell silent after that, hurt by his reaction. Weeks had passed, then months. And one day, after missing her monthly cycle, Sundari went to the local midwife. The midwife examined her and confirmed what she had hardly dared to hope. She, by all accounts, was pregnant. Sundari could hardly contain herself. She hurried home, prepared something sweet, and waited for Suresh with news that would change both their lives. When he heard it, he was elated and hugged his wife. That night, the small house felt full in a way it had never before. As the months went by, the pregnancy remained steady. By the eighth month, both of them had begun to believe that the long years of waiting were finally behind them. Then, one morning, there was another knock at the door. Sundari looked through the window. It was the same old man from months ago. Her face brightened at once. All the caution Suresh had tried to teach her disappeared at that moment. She opened the door with warmth and gratitude, bowed to him, and bent with difficulty to touch his feet. Before he could ask, she went to bring him water again. The old man watched her closely this time. His eyes rested on her swollen belly, and something in his face seemed to sharpen for a moment. Sundari did not notice this. Once again, he took out the white powder and repeated the same quiet ritual he had performed months earlier. But this time, he opened a second packet. Inside was a rich crimson powder ground so finely it drifted into the air with the slightest movement. He emptied a little of the powder into her palms and looked at her for a long moment. Some gifts must be welcomed properly, he said. When your husband falls asleep tonight, place this beneath his pillow. By morning, what has promised will remain yours. She looked at the powder and nodded. His voice remained calm, almost fatherly. It never occurred to Sundari to ask why such a thing was necessary. He continued, a mother would do anything to protect the life she carries. Correct? He said gently. So I want one final thing from you. I will continue the ceremony after I leave, he said. For that, I need something that belongs only to you, something you've worn every day. Hair is best, but anything closely tied to you will do. Sundari hesitated, but only for a second. I wear a hair attachment with my braid. Will that do? She asked. The old man nodded. So she removed the long hair piece, wrapped it in a newspaper, and placed it in his hands. She felt no fear in doing it, only gratitude. The old man immediately left afterward. I'm going to have a son, she whispered to herself, smiling. By evening, Suresh came home to find his wife looking radiant as ever. Your face is shining, he said. We're going to have a son, she replied. Suresh thought it was only the optimism of an expectant mother. He did not ask her how she had become so certain, and Sundari did not mention the old man's return. He let her keep the joy. Later that night, as Suresh settled into bed, Sundari quietly placed the crimson powder beneath his pillow, exactly as she had been told. Outside, the night was still. Only the occasional cry of an owl drifted through the dark. At midnight, there was a knock at the front door. Suresh was deep asleep beside her, and Sundari, still restless with excitement, did not want to wake him. She rose from the bed, crossed the room, and went to the door without thinking. When she opened it, she found only darkness outside. And then suddenly, she saw it. The very hairpiece that she had given the old man was hanging in the air beyond the threshold, moving gently, although the trees around it stood perfectly still. It seemed impossibly long now, trailing into the darkness beyond the doorway. And as it swayed there in the dark, a cold voice whispered her name, Sundari. She found herself stepping forward before she realized she had moved. Then she crossed the threshold and followed it into the darkness, into the night. A short while later, someone began knocking on the door again, this time at the back door. The sound was heavier now, harder, more insistent. It went on until Suresh, pulled from sleep, stumbled out of bed and made his way toward the rear of the house. When he opened the door, he froze. Suspended in the air before him was a long black wooden pestle, the kind used to grind spices and grain. For one stunned second, he simply stared at it, and without warning, it moved. The heavy wood struck him across the side of the head, and he collapsed to the floor. When he came to, only a few minutes had passed. His head throbbed. The house was quiet. At first, he thought he had dreamed what he had seen. But when he rushed to the bedroom, Sundari was gone. He searched the house, calling her name. There was no answer. Then he saw that the front door stood open. Panic took hold of him. He ran outside and began shouting for her, scanning the darkness, listening for any sign of movement. And then, without fully understanding why, he felt himself being drawn down the path toward the cremation ground. In the distance, he saw a faint light. At first, he thought it might be the dying remains of a funeral pyre. But as he got closer, he heard chanting. He tried to stop, tried to turn back, but the force pulling him forward did not ease. The light grew stronger. By the time he reached the clearing, it had become a fire blazing against the dark. There, seated cross-legged before it, was the old man. He spoke softly in a language Suresh had never heard. The words rose and fell with the wind, calm and measured, as though he was speaking to someone beyond the flames. In his hand was a narrow knife whose blade caught the firelight. And there, beside the fire, lay Sundari. The old man knelt over her. His hands moved with frightening certainty. At first, Suresh couldn't understand what he was seeing. Then, the truth struck him all at once. Suresh felt the world drop away beneath him. What he saw next never left him. The old man lifted the newborn. For one brief moment, the child cried. Then the old man turned and walked into the fire, cradling the infant in his arms. Suresh tried to scream. No sound came. When the fire finally settled, the old man was gone. Sundari lay alone beside the dying embers, as though no one ever stood there at all. The villagers searched every nearby settlement for the old man. No temple, monastery, shrine, or caravan could remember anyone matching his description. No one knew where he had come from. No one knew where he had gone. Only much later did the oldest villagers begin speaking in whispers. Years later, people no longer remembered the old man's face, only his robes and his voice, and the knock on the door. Some believed he had practiced forbidden arts. Others believed He had never been a man at all. Whatever he was, he understood one thing better than anyone. People will always open the door for someone they believe has come to bless them. For centuries, parts of northern China observed a tradition known as a ghost marriage. When an unmarried person died, some families believed their spirit should not spend an eternity alone. Ceremonies were sometimes arranged to symbolically unite two dead souls so they could continue into the afterlife together. While the custom gradually faded over time, stories surrounding these ceremonies continued to circulate throughout rural China. One such story comes from the Shaanxi province during the late Qing dynasty. Nestled among northern China's mountains and ancient villages, Shaanxi is a region where traditions surrounding ancestors and the spirit world remain deeply woven into everyday life, giving rise to stories that continue to be shared even today. Among those stories is one about a young porter named Wei. At 19 years old, Wei earned his living carrying goods and sedan chairs between isolated mountain villages. The work was demanding, but it paid better than farming, and he had grown accustomed to traveling roads that most people refused to use after sunset. One autumn evening, an elderly gentleman approached him in the marketplace. The old man asked whether Wei would help carry a bridal sedan chair to a village several hours away through the mountains. The procession would leave shortly after midnight. Wei found the request unusual. Most weddings took place during daylight. The old man simply smiled. The family has chosen an auspicious hour, 4 a.m. The payment was enough to feed Wei for nearly 2 months, so he accepted. At 3:45 a.m., the procession gathered outside an ancestral hall. There were 8 porters, 4 musicians, several men carrying red lanterns, and at the center stood an ornate bridal sedan chair decorated with faded crimson silk and hand carved dragons. The silk curtains remained tightly closed. Before anyone lifted the poles, the procession leader addressed the porters. No matter what happens during the journey, do not open the curtain. We assumed it was simply a matter of respecting tradition. The chair was lifted. To his surprise, it felt almost empty. He carried wealthy brides before. Even the lightest among them added noticeable weight. This chair felt much lighter than the wood itself. The procession climbed steadily into the mountains. The musicians walked in silence. Only a slow ceremonial drum echoed through the mist. About an hour into the journey, Wei began noticing something strange. The bamboo pole resting on his shoulder suddenly felt heavier. At first, he assumed his arms were becoming tired, but the weight continued to increase. Every few minutes, the chair seemed just a little more difficult to carry. He glanced at the other porters. None of them appeared concerned. Nobody adjusted their grip, and no one complained. Wei said nothing. As the path narrowed between steep cliffs, a dense fog rolled across the trail. The lanterns illuminated only a few meters ahead. Then he heard it. 3 soft knocks from inside the sedan chair. Wei instinctively turned his head. The curtains remained perfectly still. He looked toward the other porters. They continued walking as though nothing had happened. A few moments later, the same 3 knocks came again, this time a little louder. Wei almost spoke. Instead, he remembered the warning. He faced forward. The procession continued climbing. Just before dawn, they arrived at the groom's ancestral home. The chair was lowered into the courtyard. Family members stood quietly with incense burning in their hands. There was no celebration, only prayer. An elderly woman stepped forward and slowly opened the silk curtain. Inside rested only a folded bridal robe, a red veil, and an ancestral spirit tablet bearing the bride's name. Wei stared. The chair had been empty all along. The ceremony began. The ancestral tablets of the bride and groom were placed together. Prayers were offered. Incense filled the courtyard. By sunrise, both families believed the marriage had been completed. Wei collected his payment and quietly began the journey home. The mountain road was almost deserted. Morning mist still lingered among the trees. As he approached the same roadside shrine where the procession had rested earlier, he heard footsteps behind him. Slow, bare feet against damp earth. He stopped walking. The footsteps stopped too. Wei continued. A few moments later, they returned. Closer this time. He tightened his grip on the walking staff in his hand, but forced himself not to look back. Then he felt someone gently place a hand on his shoulder. Wei turned. Standing behind him was a young woman dressed in fashionable robes. He stood aside to let her walk, but she just stared at him. Her face was pale beneath a thin red veil. She looked directly at him. Her voice was barely louder than a whisper. "Take me back." Wei stumbled backwards. For a brief second, he recognized the embroidered phoenix stitched across her robe. It was identical to the one he found inside the chair. Then he ran. He didn't stop until the rooftops of his own village came into view. Later that afternoon, Wei visited the old man in the village and told him everything. The old villager listened without interrupting. When Wei had finished, the old man remained silent for a long time before speaking. The young woman was never willing to accept that marriage. Wei frowned. "What do you mean?" The old man looked toward the mountains. She was the daughter of a powerful family. They say she refused the match while she was alive. When she died unexpectedly, the families carried out the ceremony anyway. Wei said nothing. The old man continued. "If she spoke to you, it is possible she believed you had come to take her away instead." Wei felt the color leave his face. What happens now? He asked. The old man looked at him for a long moment, then quietly replied, I do not know. But if a restless spirit mistakes you for its savior, it may spend a very long time searching for you. We never travel that mountain road again. And among some of Shanshi's older villages, one warning still quietly repeated. If you ever find yourself beside a ghost marriage procession before sunrise, never look back. Because not every bride wishes to reach her wedding, and some are still hoping that someone will take them back home. Across Asia, folklore has survived for centuries because people kept telling these stories from one generation to the next. Whether you believe them or not, they're part of the place they come from. I'd love to know which story stayed with you the longest. Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed exploring forgotten folklore and unsettling tales from across Asia, consider subscribing to Story Lantern. There are many stories waiting to be told. Until next time, keep your lantern lit.